The letter arrived in the final gasp of winter, 1887, when Nathan Valdez was down to his last bag of beans and had nearly resigned himself to the idea that he would die alone on his homestead outside Buffalo, Wyoming. It was not a fine envelope creased in multiple places from its journey, and stained with what could have been coffee or possibly whiskey, but the return address bore the name of the matrimonial agency to which Nathan had sent his life savings 3 months prior. The raw March wind cut through Nathan's woolen coat as he stood on the dilapidated porch of his cabin, turning the letter over in his calloused hands. For a moment, he considered not opening it. What if the agency had written to inform him that no woman would agree to marry a 30-year-old half-Mexican rancher with nothing to his name but a struggling cattle operation and a ramshackle cabin? Better to face the bitter cold than that particular brand of rejection. But Nathan had never been one to shy away from hard truths. With a deep breath, he broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. "Dear Mr. Valdez," it read in neat, professional script, "we are pleased to inform you that we have found a suitable match for your specifications. Miss Rebecca Morley, age 25, has agreed to your proposal of marriage. She will arrive on the westbound train to Buffalo on March 28th. Enclosed is her photograph and a brief letter of introduction." Nathan's hands trembled as he withdrew the small photograph. The woman captured in the sepia-toned image had large, serious eyes and hair that appeared to be light, perhaps blonde, pulled back in a practical style. Her expression was composed, but there was something in the slight upward turn of her mouth that hinted at an underlying spirit. He read her letter next, written in a flowing script that looked as if it had been practiced diligently in a schoolroom. "Mr. Valdez, I am pleased to accept your offer of marriage. I have been working as a seamstress in Boston since my parents' passing 3 years ago. I am skilled at housekeeping, cooking, and have basic knowledge of animal husbandry from my childhood on my uncle's farm. I look forward to building a life together in Wyoming. Respectfully, Rebecca Morley." Nathan read the letter 3 more times before folding it carefully and placing it in his breast pocket. March 28th, just 2 weeks away. There was much to be done if he was to make the cabin suitable for a wife. He had been living like a bachelor for 2 long dirty dishes stacked haphazardly, clothes strewn about, the second bedroom used for storage rather than sleeping. That evening, as he attempted to scrub years of bachelor living from the floorboards, Nathan wondered what Rebecca Morley would make of her new home. The cabin was solid but simple. 2 bedrooms, a main living area with a stone fireplace, and a lean-to kitchen he had added 2 summers ago. Outside stood a barn, corral, chicken coop, and the beginnings of what would someday be a proper ranch house if the cattle market improved, and he could ever afford the lumber. The 2 weeks passed in a flurry of activity. Nathan repaired the loose boards on the porch, patched holes in the roof, whitewashed the interior walls, and thoroughly cleaned every inch of the cabin. He rode into Buffalo and spent precious dollars on new bedding, curtains for the windows, and even a small mirror for her bedroom. The storekeeper's wife, Mrs. Henderson, had raised an eyebrow at his purchases. "Finally making that place livable, Nathan. What's the occasion?" "I'm getting married," he'd replied, the words feeling strange on his tongue. Mrs. Henderson's eyes had widened. "A mail-order bride." "You be careful, Nathan. Those agencies don't always tell the whole truth about the women they send west." Her warning had lingered in Nathan's mind as he made the final preparations, but he pushed it aside. He had been honest in his letter to the agency describing himself and his circumstances without embellishment, and he had to trust that Rebecca had done the same. On the morning of March 28th, Nathan rose before dawn. He bathed in cold water from the pump, shaved his face clean, and put on his best clothes, which consisted of a slightly worn but clean shirt, his only pair of trousers without patches, and boots he had polished to a dull shine. He hitched his wagon and set out for Buffalo, his stomach churning with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The Buffalo train station was little more than a wooden platform with a small building that served as both ticket office and telegraph station. Nathan arrived an hour early and spent the time pacing nervously, tipping his hat to the few locals who passed by and receiving curious glances in return. It wasn't often that Nathan Valdez came to town dressed in his Sunday best. When the train finally appeared on the horizon, billowing smoke against the clear blue Wyoming sky, Nathan felt his heart leap into his throat. The locomotive pulled into the station with a screech of metal on metal, and passengers began to disembark, first a traveling salesman, then a family with 3 small children, and finally a group of men who looked to be miners headed for the hills. And then, standing alone on the platform with a single trunk at her feet, was a woman in a navy blue traveling dress. She was slender, with blonde hair tucked neatly beneath a modest hat, and she was scanning the platform with an anxious expression. Nathan removed his hat and approached her, swallowing hard. "Miss Morley," the woman turned, and Nathan saw that her face matched the photograph, though it was impossible to tell from the sepia image that her eyes were a striking shade of blue. She offered a tentative smile. "Mr. Valdez." "Nathan Valdez," Nathan nodded, suddenly aware of how rough and weathered he must appear compared to her city refinement. "Yes, madam, that's me." Rebecca Morley extended her hand. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you." As Nathan took her hand, he noticed that it was trembling slightly and her skin felt unusually warm. She swayed on her feet and he instinctively stepped closer, concerned. "Miss Morley, are you all right?" "I'm fine," she insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. "Just tired from the journey. It's been a long trip." Nathan frowned. Her face was flushed and her eyes seemed too bright. "Let me get your trunk. My wagon's just over there." As he lifted her trunk, he watched Rebecca from the corner of his eye. She walked with careful, measured steps, one hand pressed against her stomach, the other occasionally reaching out as if to steady herself on non-existent supports. By the time they reached the wagon, a fine sheen of sweat had broken out on her forehead despite the cool spring air. "Miss Morley," Nathan said as he helped her onto the wagon seat, "are you sure you're feeling well? You look feverish." Rebecca attempted a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Perhaps I caught a chill on the train. I'll be fine after some rest." Nathan wasn't convinced, but he didn't press the issue. He secured her trunk in the back of the wagon and climbed up beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. As they set off toward his homestead, he tried to make conversation, pointing out landmarks and explaining which ranches belonged to whom, but Rebecca's responses grew increasingly distracted and brief. They were halfway to the ranch when she suddenly slumped against him, her eyes rolling back in her head. "Miss Morley." Nathan dropped the reins and caught her before she could fall from the wagon. Her skin burned against his hands and her breathing was rapid and shallow. "Rebecca." There was no response. Nathan gathered her in his arms, repositioned her so she was lying across the wagon seat with her head on his lap, and snapped the reins, urging the horses to a faster pace. The wagon bounced roughly over the rutted road, and he did his best to shield Rebecca's unconscious form from the worst of the jolts. By the time they reached his homestead, Rebecca's condition had worsened. Her skin was fire-hot to the touch, and she muttered incoherently, caught in the grip of what Nathan now recognized as a dangerous fever. He carried her into the cabin and laid her gently on his bed, his mind racing. The nearest doctor was in Buffalo, a good 2 hours ride away. If he left now, he might be able to bring the doctor back by nightfall, but that would mean leaving Rebecca alone in her delirious state. Nathan stood in the center of the cabin, torn by indecision, when Rebecca began to thrash on the bed, her back arching as if in pain. That decided him. He couldn't leave her alone. Nathan moved quickly, filling a basin with cool water from the pump and gathering clean cloths. He returned to Rebecca's side and began to dab at her forehead and cheeks, alarmed by the heat radiating from her skin. "Rebecca," he said softly, hoping she could hear him through the fever's haze. "I'm going to take care of you. You're going to be all right." Her eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused and glassy with fever. "Mother," she whispered. "No, it's Nathan Valdez. You're in Wyoming at my ranch." Recognition flickered in her eyes for a moment before they slid closed again. "So hot," she mumbled. Nathan continued to bathe her face with the cool cloth, his worry deepening. He had seen fever like this before, once in a cowherd who had contracted pneumonia after falling into an icy stream, and once in his own mother, before she died. The memory sent a chill down his spine. As the afternoon wore on, Nathan realized that Rebecca needed to be made more comfortable. Her traveling dress, with its high collar and multiple layers, was surely contributing to her discomfort. But the idea of removing a lady's clothing, especially a lady who was essentially a stranger, went against everything he had been taught about proper behavior. After a moment of hesitation, Nathan decided that necessity trumped propriety. He carefully removed Rebecca's boots and stockings, then, keeping his eyes averted as much as possible, unbuttoned the outer layer of her dress. He left her in what appeared to be a cotton shift, covering her with only a light sheet despite the lingering chill in the early spring air. Throughout the night, Nathan stayed by Rebecca's side, refreshing the cool cloths on her forehead and occasionally spooning water between her parched lips when she was conscious enough to swallow. He spoke to her in low, soothing tones, telling her about the ranch, the cattle, the wild beauty of Wyoming in the spring, anything to anchor her to the world of the living. Dawn broke with no improvement in Rebecca's condition. If anything, her fever seemed higher, and her breathing had taken on a worrying rattle. Nathan knew he couldn't wait any longer to seek help. He would have to risk leaving her alone. Just as he was preparing to saddle his horse, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made him rush to the window. Relief washed over him at the sight of Doc Peterson's buggy coming up the road, with Mrs. Henderson seated beside the elderly doctor. Nathan threw open the door before they had even come to a complete stop. "Doc, thank God you're here." Doc Peterson climbed down from the buggy with the stiffness of his 70 years. "Mrs. Henderson told me you were expecting a bride yesterday. Said she had a bad feeling when you didn't come back to town." "She arrived with a fever," Nathan explained quickly. "It's gotten worse through the night." Mrs. Henderson, a stout woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair and kind eyes, gathered her medical bag. "I brought supplies. Where is she?" Nathan led them into the cabin and stood back anxiously as Doc Peterson examined Rebecca, his gnarled hands gentle as he checked her pulse and listened to her lungs. "Influenza, most likely," the doctor pronounced after several minutes. "Nasty case of it, too. Been seeing it all up and down the railway. People packed together in those cars, breathing the same air for days." He glanced up at Nathan. "You've been caring for her all night," Nathan nodded. "Did what I could, but I'm no doctor." "You did well, Mrs. Henderson assured him, already rolling up her sleeves. "But she needs proper tending now. I'll stay and help." For the next 3 days, Nathan barely slept. Despite Mrs. Henderson's offer to take over Rebecca's care, he couldn't bring himself to leave her side for more than a few minutes at a time. He took care of the essential ranch chores at dawn and dusk, rushing through feeding the livestock and checking on the cattle, then returning to the cabin where he would find Mrs. Henderson diligently bathing Rebecca's fevered skin or spooning broth into her mouth when she was lucid enough to swallow. Doc Peterson returned each day, his weathered face growing more concerned as Rebecca's fever persisted. On the third day, he took Nathan aside. "I won't lie to you, son. This isn't looking good. Her lungs are congested and that fever won't break. There's not much more medicine can do. It's in God's hands now." Nathan refused to accept this verdict. "There must be something else we can try. Some medicine, some treatment. I've given her all the medicine I have," Doc Peterson said gently. "Sometimes all we can do is wait and pray." That night, after Mrs. Henderson had finally been persuaded to return home for a few hours of rest, Nathan sat beside Rebecca's bed, watching her labored breathing. Her face was gaunt after days of illness, her blonde hair dark with sweat and tangled around her pale face. This woman had traveled across the country to marry a man she had never met, only to fall desperately ill before they had even properly spoken. The injustice of it gnawed at Nathan. "You can't die," he whispered, taking her limp hand in his. "You haven't even seen the ranch in the spring. You haven't seen how the wildflowers cover the hills, or how the new calves play in the meadow. You haven't seen the sunset from the ridge behind the cabin." His voice broke. "You haven't even had a chance to decide if you want to marry me." Rebecca's eyelids fluttered, and for a moment, Nathan thought she had heard him. But her eyes remained closed, her breathing shallow and strained. Nathan didn't remember falling asleep, but he awoke with a start sometime in the deepest part of the night. For a terrifying moment, he couldn't hear Rebecca breathing, and he lurched forward, his heart in his throat. But Rebecca was still alive, and as Nathan leaned closer, he realized that something had changed. Her breathing seemed less labored, and when he placed a hand on her forehead, her skin was cooler to the touch. Not normal, but no longer burning with the unnatural heat of the past days. "Rebecca," he whispered. To his amazement, her eyes opened, and for the first time since her collapse, they focused clearly on his face. "Water," she rasped. Nathan scrambled to fill a cup from the pitcher beside the bed and gently lifted her head, helping her to drink. She took several small sips before sinking back against the pillow, exhausted by even this small effort. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "How do you feel?" Nathan asked, scarcely daring to hope. "Weak," Rebecca answered, "but cooler." Her eyes drifted closed again. "So tired." "Sleep," Nathan told her, his heart lifting with cautious hope. "I'll be here when you wake up," and he was. For the next 2 days, as Rebecca's fever finally broke and she began the slow process of recovery, Nathan remained steadfastly by her side, only leaving to tend to the most essential chores. Mrs. Henderson continued to visit daily, bringing broths and teas to help rebuild Rebecca's strength, and Doc Peterson declared her out of danger on his 5th visit, his relief evident. "She's going to make it," the doctor told Nathan, "but she's going to be weak for some time yet. The body takes time to recover from a fever like that." Nathan nodded, understanding the implicit message. Rebecca would not be able to fulfill the duties of a wife or homesteader for some time. The timing couldn't have been worse, with spring planting and calving season upon them, but Nathan found that he didn't care. All that mattered was that she was alive. As Rebecca grew stronger, she began to take notice of her surroundings for the first time. Nathan had moved her to the 2nd bedroom, the one he had prepared for her once the worst of the fever had passed, and she seemed surprised by the simple comforts he had arranged. The curtains at the window, the small vase of early spring wildflowers on the bedside table, the patchwork quilt that Mrs. Henderson had insisted on lending. "You did all this for me?" she asked one morning as Nathan brought her a breakfast of porridge and tea. "Before you even met me." Nathan felt heat rise to his face. "Wanted you to feel welcome." A small smile touched Rebecca's lips. "That was kind of you." As the days passed, Rebecca's strength gradually returned. She progressed from sitting up in bed to sitting in a chair by the window, where she would watch the daily activities of the ranch with curious eyes. Nathan found himself explaining the rhythms of ranch life to her, the feeding schedules, the needs of the different animals, his plans for expanding the herd. "I'm sorry I can't help yet," Rebecca said one afternoon, frustration evident in her voice. "This isn't what you paid for a bedridden wife who can't cook or clean or help with the ranch." Nathan looked up from the harness he was mending beside her chair. "I didn't pay for a worker," he said quietly. "I paid for a chance to not be alone anymore." Rebecca's eyes met his and something shifted in her expression. "Tell me about yourself, Nathan Valdez. Your letter to the agency was sparse on details." Nathan set aside the harness, suddenly self-conscious. "Not much to tell. My father was Mexican, my mother American. They had a small ranch near Santa Fe. Father died when I was 15, mother when I was 20. I came north looking for better grazing land, ended up here." He shrugged. "Been building this place for 10 years now. And in 10 years you never found a local woman to marry?" Rebecca asked, her directness catching Nathan off guard. He considered how to answer honestly. "The war left a shortage of men. Most women around here had their pick of suitors, and some families. They don't look kindly on a man with Mexican blood." Understanding dawned in Rebecca's eyes. "I see." "What about you?" Nathan asked, eager to shift the focus from himself. "Your letter mentioned you were a seamstress, but not much else." Rebecca looked down at her hands, which were finally regaining some of their strength. "I was born in Massachusetts. My father was a schoolteacher, my mother a midwife. They both died of typhoid when I was 22. I had been helping my mother with her work, but without her reputation, no one would hire me as a midwife." Her voice grew softer. "I took work as a seamstress in a factory. 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, for barely enough to keep a room and food." "And that led you to answer my advertisement," Rebecca nodded. "That, and the increasingly persistent attentions of the factory foreman." A shadow crossed her face. "He made it clear what would happen if I continued to refuse him." Nathan felt a surge of protective anger. "He threatened you, not in so many words, but yes." Rebecca met his eyes again. "So when I saw your advertisement, a rancher in Wyoming seeking a bride, promising respectful treatment and a chance at a real partnership, it seemed like providence." "And then you arrived only to fall desperately ill," Nathan said ruefully. "And you took care of me," Rebecca countered. "Mrs. Henderson told me you barely left my side for 4 days, that you wouldn't rest even when she offered to watch over me." Nathan felt his face grow warm again. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Rebecca said with quiet certainty. "Not anyone. Mrs. Henderson says half the men in this territory would have sent me to the doctor in town, or worse, put me back on the train east." Nathan didn't know how to respond to that, so he simply picked up the harness again and resumed his mending, aware of Rebecca's thoughtful gaze upon him. As April turned to May, Rebecca's strength continued to improve. She began to move around the cabin, insisting on helping with small tasks despite Nathan's protests that she should rest. He would return from the fields to find her sweeping the floor or attempting to prepare a simple meal. Her face flushed with exertion, but also with a certain pride. "You don't have to push yourself," Nathan told her one evening after finding her kneading dough despite still being weak enough that her arms trembled with the effort. I do, Rebecca insisted. I came here to be your wife, not your patient. The word wife hung in the air between them. In all the chaos of Rebecca's illness, they had never actually discussed the marriage that was supposed to have taken place shortly after her arrival. The contract with the matrimonial agency stipulated that they should be married within a week of her arrival, but that deadline had come and gone while Rebecca fought for her life. Nathan cleared his throat. About that, there's no rush, you know. You should take all the time you need to recover. And two, he hesitated, to decide if this is truly what you want. Rebecca looked at him in surprise. What do you mean? I mean that you've barely had a chance to know me or this place. If you decide it's not what you want, I would understand. I could arrange for your return to Boston or perhaps help you find a position in town. Are you trying to be rid of me, Mr. Valdez? Rebecca interrupted, a challenging glint in her eye. No, of course not. I just want you to know that you have choices. Rebecca's expression softened. That's very honorable of you, but I made my choice when I boarded that train in Boston. Unless you've changed your mind. No, Nathan said quickly. I haven't changed my mind. A small smile played at the corners of Rebecca's mouth. Then perhaps we should speak to the Reverend the next time he passes through. And so it was decided. Reverend Mills made his monthly circuit through the outlying homesteads the following week, and Nathan and Rebecca were married in a simple ceremony in their own cabin, with Mrs. Henderson and Doc Peterson as witnesses. Rebecca wore a blue dress that Mrs. Henderson had helped her alter from one of her traveling outfits, and Nathan wore his Sunday best. The Reverend raised an eyebrow at the unusual circumstance of marrying a couple who had lived under the same roof for over a month, but Mrs. Henderson quickly explained about Rebecca's illness, emphasizing Nathan's proper behavior throughout the ordeal. Never seen such dedication, she declared. Sat up with her for 4 days straight, he did. If that's not the foundation for a good marriage, I don't know what is. After the ceremony, and a simple meal that Rebecca had insisted on preparing herself, with significant help from Mrs. Henderson, the guests departed, leaving the newly married couple alone for the first time. An awkward silence fell between them. Nathan stood by the fireplace, suddenly uncertain while Rebecca sat at the table, her fingers tracing the grain of the wooden surface. I should check on the livestock, Nathan finally said, desperate for something to fill the silence. Of course, Rebecca nodded, looking both relieved and disappointed. Nathan spent longer than necessary in the barn, giving the horses extra attention and checking on a pregnant cow that wasn't due to calve for another week. When he finally returned to the cabin, he found Rebecca sitting in a chair by the fire, mending one of his shirts. She looked up as he entered, and he was struck again by how beautiful she was, no longer gaunt from illness, her cheeks flushed with health and perhaps nervousness, her blonde hair loose around her shoulders in a way he had never seen it before. I thought I would make myself useful, she said, holding up the shirt with its half-mended tear. You don't have to do that tonight, Nathan said, crossing to stand near her chair. Today is special. Rebecca set aside the mending and looked up at him, her blue eyes reflecting the firelight. Yes, it is. Nathan knelt beside her chair so they were at eye level. Rebecca, I want you to know that I don't expect anything from you. We can take this slowly, very slowly if that's what you need. Rebecca studied his face for a long moment. Then, with deliberate grace, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his in a gentle kiss. When she pulled back, her eyes were filled with a mixture of uncertainty and determination. I chose this, she said softly. I chose you. I'm not afraid. Nathan's heart hammered in his chest as he raised a hand to cup her cheek. I want to do right by you, Rebecca Valdez. Her smile at the sound of her new name was all the answer he needed. The weeks that followed were a time of adjustment for both of them. Rebecca continued to build her strength, gradually taking on more of the household duties while Nathan taught her about the rhythms of ranch life. She proved to be a quick learner, absorbing his lessons about animal husbandry and gardening with an enthusiasm that both surprised and delighted him. Their nights together were tender, sometimes awkward, but always marked by a growing affection and trust. Nathan was gentle, mindful of Rebecca's still recovering health, and she was brave in her inexperience, each of them learning the other with patience and care. As spring gave way to the heat of summer, Rebecca truly came into her own on the ranch. Her background as a midwife proved unexpectedly valuable during calving season, and her skill with a needle meant that nothing went unmended for long. She established a vegetable garden behind the cabin, using seeds she had ordered from a catalog, and even began keeping a small flock of chickens that quickly became her special pride. One evening in late June, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant hills with gold and crimson, Rebecca turned to Nathan with a thoughtful expression. "You ever regret it?" she asked. "Regret what?" "Sending for a mail-order bride, taking the risk on a stranger." Nathan considered the question seriously. "No," he said finally. "Though I admit, when you collapsed with fever that first day, I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. Not because I regretted you, but because I feared I'd brought you all this way only to watch you die." Rebecca reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. "I don't remember much from those first few days, but I do remember your voice. You talked to me, even when I couldn't respond. You told me about the ranch, about the wildflowers and the calves and the sunsets." She smiled. "I think I fell in love with this place before I even saw it properly, just from your descriptions." "And what about now that you've seen it?" Nathan asked, his voice low. "Now that you've lived here, worked the land, experienced the hardships as well as the beauty." "Now I love it even more," Rebecca said simply. "And its owner too." Nathan's heart seemed to stop, then restart at a faster pace. They had been married for nearly 2 months, but neither had spoken of love before this moment. "You love me?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Rebecca turned to face him fully, her blue eyes serious in the fading light. "Yes, Nathan Valdez, I love you. How could I not? You saved my life. You've shown me nothing but kindness and respect. You've given me a home and a purpose." She squeezed his hand. "And each day, I discover something new about you to admire." Nathan raised their joined hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "I love you too, Rebecca. I think I started falling in love with you while you were still unconscious with fever. Watching you fight so hard to live, seeing your strength even in illness. You amazed me then, and you amaze me now." Rebecca leaned forward and kissed him, a kiss filled with all the love and promise of their future together. As they broke apart, she rested her head on his shoulder, and together they watched the last rays of the sun disappear behind the Wyoming hills. The summer passed in a blur of hard work and quiet contentment. The cattle thrived under Nathan's care, and Rebecca's garden yielded a bounty that she preserved for the winter months ahead. They settled into the rhythms of marriage and ranch life with surprising ease, each bringing different strengths to their partnership. In early September, as they were preparing for the first cattle drive of the season, Rebecca approached Nathan with nervous excitement. "I need to tell you something," she said, finding him in the barn where he was checking the saddle gear. Nathan looked up, immediately alert to the tension in her voice. "What is it? Are you feeling ill again?" "No, not ill exactly." Rebecca twisted her hands in her apron. "I'm with child, Nathan. We're going to have a baby." Nathan froze, the saddle strap forgotten in his hands. "A baby." He repeated, His voice barely audible for a moment. Rebecca's face fell at his stunned reaction. "Are you not pleased?" In answer, Nathan crossed the barn in 3 long strides and gathered her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in a gentle embrace. "Pleased? Rebecca, I'm overjoyed." He set her down carefully, as if she had suddenly become fragile glass. "When? How long have you known?" "The baby should come in late March or early April," Rebecca said, her face glowing with happiness now that she knew her news was welcome. "I've suspected for a few weeks, but I wanted to be certain before I told you." Nathan placed a reverent hand on her still flat stomach. "A child, our child." He looked up at her with wonder. "You've made me the happiest man in Wyoming, Rebecca Valdez." That night, as they lay together in the darkness of their bedroom, Nathan found himself unable to sleep, his mind racing with plans and concerns for the future. A baby changed everything. The cabin, which had seemed adequate for 2 adults, now felt too small and rough for a family. The second bedroom, currently used as storage, would need to be converted into a nursery. And what about Rebecca? How would she manage the rigors of ranch life while carrying a child, especially given her history of illness? "I can hear you thinking," Rebecca murmured beside him, her voice drowsy. "I'm sorry, did I wake you?" "No." She rolled over to face him, though he could barely make out her features in the darkness. "Tell me what's worrying you," Nathan sighed. "Everything. The cabin is too small, winter's coming, and I haven't laid in enough supplies. What if you get sick again? What if there are complications with the baby?" Rebecca found his hand beneath the covers. "Nathan, women have been having babies on the frontier since the first settlers arrived. I'll be fine. We'll be fine." She squeezed his hand. "But if you're concerned about the cabin, perhaps it's time to start building that proper ranch house you've talked about." Nathan had indeed spoken of his plans to build a larger home once the ranch was more established. He had even cleared land on a rise with a view of both the creek and the distant mountains, but had put off construction due to the costs. "I don't know if we can afford it right now," he admitted. "The cattle prices have been low, and we needed the new well." "What about the money I brought with me?" Rebecca suggested. "I never mentioned it because it didn't seem important, but I didn't come empty-handed, Nathan. I had savings from my work as a seamstress." Nathan was surprised. "You never said anything." "It's not a fortune," Rebecca clarified. "But it might be enough to buy lumber for a start, and if we could build before winter sets in." The idea took root in Nathan's mind. "It would be tight, but possible. We'd need to hire help, though. I can't build a house alone, not while running the ranch." "What about a barn raising, but for a house?" Rebecca suggested. "Mrs. Henderson has mentioned how the community comes together for such things." Nathan considered this. He had always kept somewhat apart from the other ranchers, partly due to his mixed heritage and partly from his natural inclination toward solitude. But since marrying Rebecca, he had begun to forge connections with their neighbors, largely through her friendly overtures. "It could work," he said slowly. "I could speak with Marshall from the neighboring ranch, and the Hendersons would help, I'm sure." "Then it's settled," Rebecca said with satisfaction. "Tomorrow we'll begin planning our new home." True to her word, Rebecca threw herself into the planning with enthusiasm. She sketched layouts for the new house, marking rooms for themselves, the baby, and even future children, because I want at least 3. She informed Nathan with a determined gleam in her eye that made him laugh and kiss her soundly. Word spread quickly about the Valdez's plans for a new home, aided by Mrs. Henderson's efficient networking. To Nathan's surprise and gratitude, offers of help poured in from neighboring ranches and even from Buffalo. Marshall brought his 2 grown sons and their team of draft horses to help clear and level the building site. The Hendersons' eldest son, who had apprenticed as a carpenter in Cheyenne, offered his expertise in exchange for Nathan's help with his fall roundup. Even Doc Peterson contributed, arriving one day with a wagon load of windows salvaged from an abandoned homestead. "They're in good condition," the elderly doctor insisted when Nathan tried to pay him. "Just need a bit of putty and paint. Consider it an early gift for that baby Rebecca's carrying." The news of the baby had spread as quickly as word of the house building, and it seemed to Nathan that the entire community had taken a personal interest in ensuring that the child was born into a proper home. Construction began in late September, with the goal of completing the exterior before the first heavy snows. The foundation was laid and the frame raised in a remarkable display of community effort, culminating in a day that reminded Nathan of the barn raisings he had witnessed as a boy in New Mexico. Nearly 20 men gathered to raise the main timbers, while the women, including a proudly contributing Rebecca, provided a feast that fed the workers throughout the day. By mid-October, the house had walls, a roof, and windows, though the interior remained unfinished. Nathan and Rebecca moved in anyway, eager to establish themselves in their new home before winter set in, and Rebecca's pregnancy advanced further. The house was simple but solid: 3 bedrooms, a large kitchen with a cast iron stove that had been Rebecca's special request, a comfortable living area with a stone fireplace, and a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides of the structure, offering views of both the sunrise and sunset. "It's perfect," Rebecca declared on their first night in the new house, standing in the center of the mostly empty living room. "I can already imagine how it will look when we've furnished it properly. A rug there, curtains on the windows, a cradle by the fire for the baby." Nathan watched her with a swelling heart, marveling at how thoroughly this woman had transformed his life in just 7 months. From a solitary rancher scraping by on the Wyoming frontier to a husband, soon-to-be father, and respected member of the community, the change was almost beyond comprehension. As winter settled over the ranch, bringing short days and long, cold nights, Nathan and Rebecca found comfort in their new home and in each other. Rebecca's pregnancy progressed well, her belly growing round beneath the loose dresses she had sewn in anticipation of her changing form. The morning sickness that had plagued her early on faded, and she bloomed with a vibrant health that seemed worlds away from the desperately ill woman who had arrived in Wyoming. Nathan worried nonetheless, especially as the winter storms isolated them from town for days at a time. He laid in extra supplies, ensuring they had everything they might need if Rebecca went into labor during a blizzard. He convinced Doc Peterson to provide detailed instructions for delivering a baby, which he studied with intense concentration, determined to be prepared for any eventuality. "You're going to wear yourself out with worry," Rebecca chided him one evening as he pored over the doctor's notes for the 10th time. "The baby isn't due for 3 more months. I just want to be prepared," Nathan insisted. "Last time you needed medical attention, I was completely useless." Rebecca set aside her knitting a tiny cap for the baby and came to stand behind him, wrapping her arms around his shoulders. "You weren't useless at all. You kept me alive, Nathan, and you'll do the same for our child if necessary." She pressed a kiss to the top of his head. "But it won't be necessary. This baby and I are both strong." As if in agreement, the baby chose that moment to kick vigorously, causing Rebecca to laugh and guide Nathan's hand to the spot. "See, strong already." The winter months passed slowly, marked by the gradual growth of Rebecca's belly and the quiet routine of ranch life in the cold season. Nathan tended to the livestock, repaired equipment in preparation for spring, and continued to work on the interior of the house. Rebecca sewed baby clothes, preserved the last of their fall harvest, and began to make plans for expanding her garden and chicken flock in the spring. In late February, a thaw brought a welcome respite from the winter isolation. Nathan seized the opportunity to make a trip into Buffalo for supplies, leaving Rebecca with strict instructions to rest and Mrs. Henderson for company. When he returned late in the day, his wagon loaded with provisions, he was met by the sound of Rebecca's laughter from inside the house. Entering, he found her seated at the kitchen table with Mrs. Henderson and a young woman he didn't recognize. "Nathan," Rebecca exclaimed, rising awkwardly to greet him, her advanced pregnancy making her movements less graceful than usual. "You remember Mrs. Henderson, of course, and this is her niece, Rose, who's just arrived from Denver. She's a trained midwife." Nathan greeted the women, his eyes lingering on the young midwife with undisguised relief. "A midwife? That's wonderful news." Rose Henderson smiled, clearly used to such reactions from expectant fathers. "Mrs. Henderson wrote to me about your wife's condition and her history of illness. I was planning to visit in the spring anyway, so I decided to come early. If you're amenable, I'd like to stay in the area until after the birth." "Amenable," Nathan repeated. "Miss Henderson, you're a godsend. Of course we're amenable. Where are you staying? If you need accommodation, she's staying with us, dear Mrs. Henderson interrupted with an amused glance at Rebecca. "Though she's welcome to come out to the ranch whenever Rebecca needs her." The presence of a trained midwife lifted a tremendous weight from Nathan's shoulders. Rose visited the ranch regularly over the next few weeks, checking on Rebecca's progress and pronouncing both mother and baby to be in excellent health. She also provided practical advice on preparing for the birth, much of which confirmed what Rebecca already knew from her own experience assisting her mother. March arrived with the first tentative signs of spring green shoots pushing through the melting snow, longer days, and the return of birds from their winter migrations. Rebecca, now in her final month of pregnancy, moved more slowly but remained determined to keep up with her household duties. "You should be resting," Nathan admonished one morning when he found her kneading bread dough. "I'll rest when the baby comes," Rebecca replied stubbornly. "Until then, we still need to eat." Their good-natured argument was interrupted by a knock at the door. Nathan opened it to find Rose Henderson, her medical bag in hand, looking somewhat windblown. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said as Nathan invited her in. "But I was in the area checking on Mrs. Collins. Her baby came last night, a healthy boy, and I thought I'd stop by to see how Rebecca is doing." Rebecca greeted the midwife warmly, wiping flour from her hands. "I'm well, just having the usual argument with my husband about how much I should be doing," Rose smiled. "A common dispute in these final weeks. How about a compromise?" "Rebecca can stay active. It's actually good for bringing on labor when the time is right, but perhaps limit herself to lighter tasks." Nathan looked as if he might object, but a stern glance from Rebecca silenced him. "That seems reasonable," he conceded. Rose stayed for tea, checking Rebecca's pulse and listening to the baby's heartbeat before preparing to leave. As she was donning her coat, she turned to Nathan with a serious expression. "Mr. Valdez, I wanted to ask, have you made arrangements for someone to help after the birth?" "Rebecca will need assistance for at least a week or two." Nathan blinked, caught off guard by the question. "I assumed I would help, and Mrs. Henderson offered to come by as well." "Mrs. Henderson has her hands full with her husband's store and her own household," Rose pointed out gently. "And while your help will be invaluable, Rebecca will need a woman's assistance with certain matters." Nathan looked to Rebecca, who seemed equally uncertain. "I hadn't really thought about it," she admitted. "In Boston, New mothers often have female relatives to help, but here. I could stay, Rose offered. I usually remain with my patients for a week after delivery, but I could extend that if needed. My schedule is relatively open right now. Relief washed over Nathan's face. We would be grateful for your help, Miss Henderson. And of course, we would compensate you for your time. Rose waved away the mention of payment. We can discuss that later. For now, I want you both to know that you're not alone in this. Between myself, Aunt Margaret, and the other women in the community, Rebecca will have all the support she needs. After Rose's departure, Nathan found Rebecca standing by the window, one hand resting on her swollen belly, her expression thoughtful. "What's on your mind?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. Rebecca turned to him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I was just thinking about how different this is from what I imagined when I agreed to come west. I thought I would be so alone, especially in moments like this." She gestured to her pregnant form. "But instead, I find myself surrounded by kindness and support from people who were strangers less than a year ago." Nathan wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "This community has surprised me too. Before you came, I kept mostly to myself, didn't see the point in getting too involved with others. And now I understand that we need each other out here. No one survives the frontier alone." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "But most of all, we need each other, Rebecca. You and me, that's the foundation of everything else." Rebecca leaned into his embrace, and together they watched the lengthening shadows of late afternoon stretch across their land, their home, built with their own hands and the help of the community that had embraced them. The baby came on a clear, crisp morning in late March, almost a year to the day since Rebecca had first arrived in Wyoming. Nathan had been up since dawn, tending to a newborn calf, when he heard Rebecca call his name with an urgency that sent him racing back to the house. He found her standing in the kitchen, one hand braced against the table, the other cradling her belly. "It's time," she said simply. Nathan's carefully rehearsed plans momentarily deserted him as panic flooded his system. "Now, are you sure? Should I get Rose or Doc Peterson? Both?" Despite her discomfort, Rebecca laughed. "Yes, now, yes, I'm sure, and yes, send for Rose. Doc Peterson only if necessary." Her face contorted with another contraction. "But first, help me to the bedroom." Nathan sprang into action, guiding Rebecca to the bedroom they had prepared for the birth. Once she was settled, he hesitated, torn between staying with her and fetching the midwife. "Go," Rebecca urged during a moment of respite between contractions. "I'll be fine for now. The pains are still far apart." With reluctance, Nathan saddled his fastest horse and rode toward town at a breakneck pace. He found Rose at her aunt's house, thankfully, and she was ready within minutes, mounting her own horse despite Nathan's offer to take her in the wagon. "The wagon would be too slow," she explained as they set off back toward the ranch. "And time can be essential in these matters." They arrived to find Rebecca still managing well, though her contractions had strengthened and come closer together. Rose took charge immediately, shooing Nathan from the room while she examined Rebecca. "Everything looks perfect," she announced when she allowed him back in. "The baby is in the correct position, and Rebecca's body is doing exactly what it should." She turned to Nathan with a sympathetic smile. "Now we wait. First babies often take their time." The waiting proved to be the hardest part for Nathan. Hours passed as Rebecca's labor progressed, each contraction seeming to draw more strength from her. Nathan stayed by her side, wiping her brow, offering water and providing his hand for her to squeeze, which she did with surprising force during the worst pains. As the sun began to set, Rose's expression grew more focused. "We're getting close now," she told them. "Rebecca, on the next contraction, I want you to push." What followed was the most challenging and miraculous experience of Nathan's life. Rebecca's strength amazed him as she worked to bring their child into the world, her face set with determination despite her exhaustion. Rose coached her expertly, her calm voice a steadying influence for both of them. Finally, as the first stars appeared in the evening sky, a lusty cry filled the room, and Rose lifted a squirming, red-faced infant for them to see. "You have a son," she announced, her professional demeanor momentarily broken by a wide smile. "A healthy, strong boy." Nathan found himself unable to speak as Rose cleaned the baby, wrapped him in a soft blanket Rebecca had prepared, and placed him in his mother's arms. Rebecca looked up at Nathan, her face radiant despite her exhaustion. "He looks like you," she whispered. Nathan knelt beside the bed, overwhelmed by the sight of his wife holding their child. The baby had a shock of dark hair, and skin a shade darker than Rebecca's fair complexion, clear signs of Nathan's Mexican heritage. "He's perfect," Nathan managed, his voice rough with emotion. He reached out tentatively to touch his son's tiny hand, marveling when the infant's fingers instinctively curled around his. "What shall we call him?" Rebecca asked. They had discussed names but had never settled on a final choice. Now, looking at his son's face, Nathan knew. "Daniel," he said. "After my father, if that's all right with you." Rebecca nodded, tears of joy slipping down her cheeks. "Daniel Valdez. It's perfect." Rose allowed the new family some time together before gently insisting that both mother and baby needed rest. She helped Rebecca with the baby's first feeding, then showed Nathan how to swaddle his son while Rebecca dozed. "You did well today, Mr. Valdez," Rose told him quietly as they stood watching the sleeping infant. "Many men cannot bear to be present for childbirth, but you gave Rebecca exactly the support she needed." Nathan shook his head, still dazed by the events of the day. "She's the strong one. I just tried to stay out of the way." Rose smiled knowingly. "Sometimes that's precisely what is needed." The days that followed passed in a blur of joy and adjustment. True to her word, Rose stayed at the ranch, guiding Rebecca through the early days of motherhood and teaching Nathan how to help with the baby. Mrs. Henderson arrived with meals prepared by the women of Buffalo, ensuring that the new parents had one less concern during this precious and exhausting time. Daniel proved to be a good-natured baby, with a healthy appetite and a surprisingly strong set of lungs when he was displeased. Nathan found himself captivated by his son's every movement and expression, often neglecting ranch chores to simply watch the baby sleep in his cradle. "The cattle won't tend themselves," Rebecca teased gently one afternoon when she caught him standing over the cradle instead of mending fences as he had planned. "They can wait," Nathan replied, unrepentant. "He changes every day. I don't want to miss anything." Rebecca came to stand beside him, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Remember when I first arrived, so sick you thought I might die? Would you have believed then that we would be standing here now, watching our son sleep?" Nathan slipped an arm around her waist. "I hoped. Even then I hoped." As spring unfurled across the Wyoming landscape, the Valdez family settled into their new rhythm of life. Rose eventually returned to town, though she visited regularly, bringing news and sometimes accompanying other women who were curious to meet the newest member of their community. To Nathan's surprise, the birth of Daniel seemed to complete their integration into the social fabric of the area. Ranchers who had previously given him only a curt nod now stopped to ask after his family. Women who had never spoken to him before sought out Rebecca, bringing gifts for the baby and invitations to quilting circles and social gatherings. "It's like the baby was the final piece that made us belong here," Rebecca observed one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset while Daniel nursed contentedly at her breast. Nathan nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. A year ago, I was alone in that old cabin, wondering if I'd made a mistake sending for a bride I'd never met. Now look at us. Rebecca smiled up at him, her face illuminated by the golden light of the setting sun. No regrets then? Only one, Nathan said seriously. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. Oh, I regret not sending for you sooner. He leaned over to kiss her softly. Think of all the time we could have had. We have now, Rebecca reminded him, and all the days ahead. She looked down at their son who had fallen asleep at her breast. Besides, some things are worth the wait. As the year progressed, the ranch flourished along with the Valdez family. The cattle herd increased, Rebecca's garden yielded a bountiful harvest, and Daniel grew from a newborn to a curious, active infant who delighted in exploring the world around him. Nathan expanded their operations, adding sheep at Rebecca's suggestion. The wool will be valuable, and they're easier for me to manage with the baby than cattle, she had reasoned practically. By the time their first anniversary arrived in late March, the transformation of Nathan's struggling homestead into a thriving ranch was well underway. To celebrate the occasion, Rebecca insisted on hosting a gathering for the friends and neighbors who had supported them throughout the year. It's only right that we share our good fortune, she told Nathan as they prepared for the event. These people helped build our home, delivered our son, and welcomed us into their community. The least we can do is offer them a good meal and our gratitude. The celebration was a resounding success, with nearly 30 people gathering at the Valdez ranch. Tables were set up on the porch and in the yard, laden with food prepared by Rebecca and several neighboring women. Daniel, now a year old and taking his first tottering steps, charmed everyone with his sunny disposition and infectious laugh. As the afternoon waned, Doc Peterson raised a glass in a toast. To Nathan and Rebecca Valdez, he proclaimed, who have shown us all the power of perseverance, hard work, and love. When Rebecca arrived a year ago, so ill we feared for her life, who among us could have predicted the flourishing family and ranch we see today? A chorus of "Hear, hear" went up from the assembled guests, and Nathan found himself unexpectedly moved by the doctor's words and the genuine warmth in the faces around him. He squeezed Rebecca's hand where it rested on his arm, unable to find words to express his gratitude for the life they had built together. Later that night, after the guests had departed and Daniel was asleep in his crib, Nathan and Rebecca stood together on their porch, gazing up at the star-filled Wyoming sky. "Happy anniversary, Mrs. Valdez," Nathan said softly, drawing her close against the evening chill. Rebecca turned in his arms, her face tilted up to his. "A year ago today, I was fighting for my life, and you were fighting alongside me. I don't remember much from those days, but I do remember feeling safe. Even in the depths of that fever, I somehow knew that you wouldn't let me go." Nathan brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I couldn't. From the moment you stepped off that train, something in me recognized you as mine to protect, to care for," he smiled. "Though I've since learned that you're more than capable of taking care of yourself and me, and Daniel, and half the ranch besides." Rebecca laughed softly. "We take care of each other. That's what makes this work." She rose on tiptoe to kiss him, a kiss that still held the power to make his heart race after a year of marriage. When she pulled away, her eyes were bright with emotion. "I love you, Nathan Valdez. Thank you for sending for me, for caring for me when I was ill, for giving me this beautiful life and our wonderful son." "I love you too, Rebecca," Nathan replied, his voice rough with feeling. "More than I ever thought possible." They stayed on the porch for a long while, wrapped in each other's arms, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, the soft lowing of cattle in the distant pasture, the occasional whicker of horses in the barn, the rustle of wind through the new leaves on the trees they had planted around their home. Sounds of the life they had built together, beginning with a desperate leap of faith and a fever that nearly ended their story before it truly began. As they finally turned to go inside, Rebecca paused in the doorway, her hand on Nathan's arm. "I never asked you what made you decide to send for a bride instead of courting a local girl. Surely there must have been some women in the territory willing to consider you, despite what you said about your heritage." Nathan considered the question thoughtfully. "Loneliness, I suppose. The kind that settles into your bones during those long winter nights when there's no one to talk to but yourself." He shrugged. "And hope. Hope that somewhere out there was someone who could see past the rough edges and mixed blood to the man beneath." "Well," Rebecca said with a tender smile, "your hope brought me across a continent, and my desperation for a better life brought me to your door. And look what we've built from that unlikely beginning." Nathan nodded, drawing her into their home, the home they had created together. "A family," he said simply. "We've built a family." And as they closed the door against the night, Nathan reflected that sometimes the greatest journeys began with the most uncertain steps. A desperate man sending away for a bride he had never met. A frightened woman boarding a train to marry a stranger. An illness that could have ended everything before it began. And through it all, the stubborn, miraculous persistence of hope and the unexpected blessing of love found in the midst of adversity. It was not the story either of them had imagined for themselves, but standing in their home with their son sleeping peacefully nearby and their future stretching bright before them, Nathan knew it was far better than anything he could have dreamed alone.